Nathan Ammon. So Nathan is a historian, an author, an international broadcaster, fellow of the Royal Historical Society, I believe. He was a foremost historian for the 15th century, Tudor times, and particularly the rise of Henry Tudor. So Nathan's written a whole host of books, which will also be on sale, signed copies in the breaks and ice as well, including The House of Beaufort, The Bastard Line That Captured the Throne, Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, and not least, published last year, Stone of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, which was published in 2024 and has had absolutely incredible acclaim and reception and response to it. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to him.
Right, well, thank you everyone for coming out on what is a very cold evening. I can tell you it's much warmer in London, but it always is. We've got that cluster of pollution above us, I guess. That keeps us warm. I've got my coat. But I'm pleased that you decided to come out to listen to what I hope is a topic that's going to interest you. This is an exclusive talk I've written just for tonight. And I'm going to try and look at some of the history of Lichfield and the role that it played in the rise of the Tudor dynasty, you may view. So on the 22nd of August, 1485, on a small rural Leicestershire field, not too far from here, 331 years of Plantagenet rule was brought to an end, amidst much slaughter and much bloodshed. The King, Richard III, was dead. In his place stood a new king, a man who one chronicler claimed had no money, no power, and no right to the crown of England. A complete unknown to the people that he now sought to rule, and his name was Henry VII. Now this moment was, in many ways, the culmination of a 3-decade-long brutal civil war that we remember today as the Wars of the Roses. It was a conflict that divided the houses of York and Lancaster. In 1461, after reigning for 39 years, the Lancastrian king Henry VI was booted off the throne. He was replaced by Edward of York, who now became King Edward IV. 10 years later, Edward IV of York briefly lost his throne back to Henry VI of Lancaster, before 6 months later, Edward IV returned. The crown is being passed back and forth like past a parcel in many ways. Now Edward does win the throne back in 1471, and he goes on something of a purge, looking to remove a lot of his Lancastrian rivals to the throne. He has Henry VI, for example, murdered. Now Edward is the true victor in many ways of the Wars of the Roses, at least in their original guise as a brutal conflict between York and Lancaster, and he would reign until the year 1483. When aged just 40 years old, he died. He was succeeded by his 12-year-old son, who now became Edward V. Or at least that was the plan. That was the plan that Edward IV hoped would happen, and that is the plan that many people in England hoped what would happen. But 78 days later, it was not young Edward V who was being crowned King of England, nor was it his younger brother, Prince Richard, but it was their uncle who now stepped up to accept the throne of England. It was their uncle who now rose to the throne as King Richard III. Now those York boys, they were sent by their uncle to the Tower of London, where they gradually disappeared from view. People today still question what was the fate of these princes in the Tower. What I will say is many people claim to know the answer. The truth is none of us know what happened to those boys. I have my suspicions, other people think differently. what is important for our story is that those boys did go into the tower and they did disappear. The king in their place was their uncle, Richard III. Now, because of this later episode, this episode that took place within a matter of months in the year 1483, the once victorious and supreme House of York, it now began to turn inward on itself. We often classify this period that I'm going to discuss as part of the original Wars of the Roses, but in many ways it's a completely different aspect. It's a civil war in many ways, but within the House of York. You see, whatever the merits of Richard III taking the crown, whatever the merits of him doing that, there were many people on his side, on the House of York side, who were not content, who were not happy with his sudden rise to the throne. This group of Yorkist diehards, men who had fought and spilled blood for the House of York up to this point, they now defected. They now looked to find somebody, anyone, who could be the vehicle for their vengeance against Richard III. The only adult of royal lineage, the only adult who had some blood in his veins that could be traced back to Edward III, but who was crucially outside Richard III's grasp at this moment in time. That was Henry Tudor. You see, this man, Henry Tudor, he had spent the previous 12 years outside England. He had spent this period in exile across the Channel in Brittany and then in France. When he had been just a teenage boy, when King Edward IV had gone on that purge to get rid of Lancastrian rival claimants, young Henry Tudor, aged just 14 years old, with a very slender amount of royal blood in his veins, he had been spirited abroad by his uncle Jasper Tudor. And it was there abroad that he was languishing in limbo, pretty much just waiting for the moment that he would be captured and he would be killed. But now, in the spring of 1483, because Richard III had risen to the throne, this group of Yorkist diehards, numbering about 400 to 500, they now left England behind. They left Richard III behind, and they travelled across to Brittany, where they now begged this complete random Welsh nobody, Henry Tudor, to be their king. Or at least they would accept him as their king if Henry Tudor, if he signed a deal, if he made a pact with these Yorkist diehards. And that pact was if he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, the sister of those missing princes in the Tower. If Henry Tudor married this young woman, then these Yorkist defectors, they would support his claim to the throne. They were looking for an emotional investment in any sort of new royal dynasty. Now, the next 2 years is a very fascinating period that many people do overlook, and it is a period where Henry Tudor was over there across the Channel trying to cobble together men and money to create an army that he could invade England with. He did manage to gather some modest funding from some merchants. He was able to buy a few thousand French troops. These are French mercenaries, trained soldiers, men who know how to kill and who relish the opportunity to go across the Channel and inflict some slaughter on the English in England. We've got to remember, this is the 15th century. England had been with war with France for much of the previous 120 years. And now an English army is going across to France. So you now have this group of French mercenaries who are very much looking forward to going across to England. So Henry does get together these 2,000 to 3,000 French mercenaries. He has these 400 to 500 Yorkist rebels. And on the 1st of April 1485, from Harfleur Harbour, he gives the signal for his small fleet to begin its voyage. This is the beginning of what would become known as the Bosworth campaign. These few thousand hardy soldiers on this boat in a French port. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus on this very small window of time, the Bosworth campaign, without which there would be no Tudors. We would not be studying the Tudors, we would not be talking about them, we'd not be obsessing over them, we'd not be going to watch musicals about them, if it wasn't for this successful campaign. Now, Henry Tudor was not a stupid man. In fact, it's probably widely accepted that he's one of the smartest men ever to sit on the English throne. And he certainly was a very shrewd man. So when he set sail, when he left this French port, he set his sat-nav to home. And that sat-nav was set for West Wales, where he'd been born and where he had been raised. So after a week of bobbing along in the English Channel and going through the Irish Sea, on the 7th of August 1485, just before sunset, Henry's fleet made landfall at this very inlet off the Pembrokeshire coast. This is Mill Bay, and it's gorgeous, although that is very typical Welsh summer weather. But it is a very beautiful and quite secluded inlet, and as I say, it was just before sunset that Henry Tudor reaches this bay, completely undetected. We are told by one chronicler that for the first time when he stepped foot on Welsh soil in 40 years, or Welsh land I guess, Henry fell to his knees and he prayed to the heavens. He was home, but now the hard work really began. Now there's a remarkable later tradition that was told throughout Wales in the 1600s about this very moment. There was an Elizabethan historian called Rhys Merrick, and Rhys Merrick claimed that when the Tudor army lands on this beach, an old woman appears, and she goes up to Jasper Tudor, and Jasper Tudor is Henry's uncle. He's the man who, when Henry was just a boy, had effectively grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, chucked him into a boat, and sailed off abroad. Now Jasper Tudor, quite an elderly man, he's back with his nephew. And this old woman approaches Jasper Tudor, and she says to him, "Long mayst thou live, for thou hast better kept thy nephew than King Richard has kept his." Ouch, that's a burn, isn't it? Obviously, I don't think there was a random old woman walking along the beach at the time that this foreign army had invaded, but I think it's quite a nice story, and it shows exactly where the Tudor myth was started to be built long after this campaign. Now, random old woman, of course, notwithstanding, the voyage that they had just completed, that was but phase 1 of this campaign. Now came phase 2, which is going to be that very difficult march towards their destiny. And though they knew it not yet, they did not know exactly where they were going, this is the true beginning of the march to Bosworth. Now, advanced intelligence had told this Tudor army that Pembroke, which is where Henry was born, is where his uncle Jasper had once been Earl. Advanced intelligence told them this castle and this area was firmly in the hands of those loyal to Richard III. They could not take the most obvious route to London by going across the south, by following what is today the M4, which, for those who know the M4, they probably wouldn't have got very far. Anyway. So they landed at Mill Bay, and the decision is now taken that they need to head north, which was going to be a much tougher route for them. Now, Henry likely issued orders to his men, particularly those French mercenaries in his army, to keep their hands to themselves and to keep their swords sheathed until the moment for battle was near. And so, onwards they now pressed. The first town of note they reached was Haverfordwest, and they were met with no resistance. In fact, there were modest numbers of people from Haverfordwest who now began to join Henry's side. So they've already made the right decision to go north. Now the Tudors, as I mentioned, they are not an unknown quantity in this neck of the woods. Henry was born in Pembroke. Jasper used to be the local lord. Old loyalties clearly die hard, and there are now some modest Welshmen joining the side. With the first town of North down, the next day Henry's army continued to push. An army that has many accents, many languages, many politics. It's very much a motley crew if there ever was one. They now began climbing the very exposed Preseli Mountains, which incidentally supposedly where Elvis Presley has his ancestors from, hence his name. But I think that's another bit of historical nonsense as well. But nonetheless, over the Preseli Mountains they go, and they must have been very thankful that on the third day of their march they finally begin the decline into Cardigan. Local tradition says that Henry Tudor stayed in the Three Mariners Inn, a pub which still does exist. I think it's probably likely that he stayed in a castle rather than some random pub. Another thing about local history, always retain a sceptical eye when it comes to the story pubs often tell about themselves. After Cardigan, they continue, they head north, they pass through Quindafydd, they go through Aberystwyth until they reach Machynlleth. Throughout this march, they are drawing support from curious locals. Henry also now began to send out letters to all of the local Welsh chieftains. He was demanding that they raise all of their men and they come to his side at once, since was he not their prince? Was he not a Welshman bred in this very land alongside them? Did he not understand Welsh hatred of their long-held subservience to the English crown? These are the letters Henry is sending out, pumping out this kind of political propaganda to get people to join his side. Now, as the march reaches the end of its first week, with the rising peaks of Snowdonia all above them, the decision is made, now is the time to turn eastwards, and now is the time to turn towards England. They navigate through the various valleys of Merionethshire. I don't think it would have been quite as straight as that, but I liked it when I drew it at Spain. I'm sure it would be up and down through the valleys, avoiding some of the more difficult terrain, as they were heading, as I said, off towards England. Now there is a gradual climb near Welshpool at the end of this particular phase of the march, where they have to go up a mountain called Long Mountain. I mean, just think about that. You're an army. You've come across from sea after a week. You've already marched for a week through Wales. It's hard enough driving through Wales at times. And they've now got to go back up to the top of this windswept ridge. And it was here on top of Long Mountain where they could see the fertile plains of Shropshire beginning to unfold before them. And it is only at this moment that Henry's fruits throughout, Henry's arduous efforts even began to bear fruit throughout this period. Because it is on Long Mountain where he sees on the horizon an army of 2,000 Welshmen marching towards him. These are the men of an influential South Walian known as Rhys ap Thomas. And Rhys ap Thomas, to this moment in time, had been holding South Wales for Richard III. He was the reason that Henry Tudor had to go north in the first place. But now, on top of this mountain, Rhys ap Thomas comes to Henry. They're distant cousins, but they do not know each other. They probably have never met one another. But now, they chatted, they exchanged pleasantries, and they struck a deal. In the event of a Tudor victory, Rhys ap Thomas demanded of Henry that he would make him the most powerful man in South Wales, not just in fact, but in office. To this point, Welshmen were not allowed to hold any of the offices that were given to Englishmen who came in. Rhys ap Thomas now demanded that Henry officially make him the Lieutenant of South Wales. And if Henry did that, then these 2,000 men and all of the influence, they are Henry's to use. And of course, Henry agreed to this. Spirits were further raised when that evening, yet more men, another couple of thousand men, came from the north. And these were under the command of another Welshman in Greece, because they're always in Greece during this period. This is under the command of a Welshman called Rhys Fawr, which means Rhys the Mighty. And he was a powerful farmer, and he brought plenty of fattened oxen, sheep. He brought them down to this army, where on this particular evening, all of the Welsh, French, and English troops, they must have had some party. They had a feast, they enjoyed each other's company, they drank some wine, and they effectively partied on top of this mountain, like some sort of 1980 grave that we could get down where I live. And this is great news for Henry. He's now starting to build numbers. He's starting to get a movement behind him. Now, just why did the Welshmen, I think this is a very important part of our campaign, just why did the Welshmen, several thousand of them, care about who wore the English crown? When we consider that they had been conquered 200 years earlier, and it doesn't really matter who existed on the English throne, the life for the average Welshman was going to be one existing under quite a corrupt English government in Wales. So why did they now turn for Henry Tudor? Why were they now invested in his rise? Well, in the previous years leading up to this campaign, the Welsh bards, you can call them the influencers of their day if you want, the Welsh bards had declared that Henry Tudor was in fact none other than the son of prophecy. And what is the son of prophecy, apart from a very cool title for a book? Well, throughout the medieval period, there was a wonderful bardic tradition in Wales that foretold of the appearance of a Messiah. And this Messiah would one day rise up, defeat the Saxons, and drive them back into the sea and reconquer the island for the ancient Britons. And this is the kind of prophecy that was current during the 11th, 12th, 13th and 14th centuries in Wales. And many people had been given this title, Son of Prophecy, by the bards. But now, in 1483, 1484, 1485, when Henry Tudor, this Welsh-born and Welsh-bred man, is laying claim to the English throne, well, the bards, they lose their minds. They go to complete overdrive, they begin pumping out all of this propaganda, calling him their son of prophecy. You could say these are very desperate poets. And in the words of a Welsh queen, Bonnie Tyler, they clearly are holding on for a hero. And this hero is going to be Henry Tudor. Now, when Henry began his campaign to become king, like I say, they were calling him the son of prophecy, and he chose this moment to raise his brand new battle standard. You might kind of recognise it today. What Henry is doing with his new battle standard is he adopts this red dragon. And this red dragon was very well known during the medieval period as belonging to a guy called Cadwallader. And Cadwallader was the last ever man to call himself King of the Britons. And he was a king who existed in the 7th century. Henry now claimed that he was Cadwallader's descendant, and he is now the son of prophecy, the man who's coming back to lead the Britons. And this makes sense in many ways, because Henry has a very weak claim to the English throne through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. It's rubbish compared to the Plantagenets. So what he decides to do is say, so what? You're all descended from William the Conqueror. Well, I'm descended from the King of the Britons, and this is my island. It is very interesting propaganda, and he sticks it on the background of green and white, which is the Tudor family colours. And he creates what today is the coolest flag in the entire world. Just a point to that. If you ask most Welsh people today, 9 out of 10 people believe this is a red dragon standing on a field. And it's not. Green and white were the Tudor family colours. It's not a dragon standing on a field randomly blowing fire. Now, They've reached the end of their march of Wales. England is now unfolding between them. And the date is the 17th of August. They now decide to leave Long Mountain behind with their nice dragon flags, and they begin the descent towards Shrewsbury. Now, it is when they approach this gate, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, but this is Welsh Bridge, and this was known as Welsh Gate. And as you can imagine, it was constructed to keep the Welsh out of Shrewsbury. And it did this job very well. You know, for centuries, this gate kept back those marauding naughty Welshmen from inflicting their stag do's and hen parties on Shrewsbury. But now, on the 17th of August, Henry Tudor and his army now approach this gate, and they find that it's actually locked to them. This is the only route they can get across the River Severn. They need to get across this bridge if they are going to go any further. Now, messages are sent in to the town, and they demand the bailiff, a guy called Thomas Mitton, they demand that he at once open the portcullis, that he opens the gateway and lets the army come in. But Mitton had sworn an oath, and he had sworn an oath to King Richard III that he would hold his town no matter what. He would hold it, in fact, over his dead body, he says. Or rather, he says, they have to climb over my belly to enter this town. The insinuation being, of course, that he would need to be dead. So he told the Tudor invader where to go. I'm sure it included some expletives. Now, this would be an embarrassment for Henry Tudor if he was forced to march his army somewhere else to cross the river. He was claiming to be a king of England, and now he's not allowed to enter his own kingdom. But help was on the way. A messenger arrived, went up to Thomas Mitton and whispered into his ear, and Mitton turned white. I don't have a source for that. I'm imagining something like that likely happened. But a messenger did approach Mitton, and Mitton then gives orders for the portcullis to be raised and the army to come through, provided that they cause no trouble. Tradition states, again, tradition is always a dangerous term when we come to history, tradition states that Thomas Mitton wanted to be absolved of his oath. So what he did was he lay on the floor with his belly up, and Henry Tudor literally stepped over him, and that's how he claimed that he could be absolved of his oath to Richard III. That didn't happen. I know that, I believe. Some guy would just lie on the floor next to him, step over him. Another tradition states that Henry Tudor enjoyed a very nice lunch in what is now known as Tudor House in the centre of Shrewsbury. But good as his word, Henry makes sure his army marches through Shrewsbury and they do not touch any of the locals. He can't have his men inflicting great slaughter. He's trying to claim to be a king of England. So Shrewsbury is successfully navigated because of this curious messenger. And onwards, Henry's army moved. They're striding now into England, foot by foot, mile by mile. They are perhaps growing in stature as they went. And of course, I'm sure this part of the march is much easier to walk than Wales had been behind them. And what an operation this must have been, because we've got thousands of men shuffling along, carrying whatever supplies they could get their hands on, or weapons they could carry. They don't even really know where they're going. They're just marching. Most days, they are putting in between 15 and 20 miles every single day. And as I said, some of that would feature some very torturous climbs. Now, the next destination for the Tudors is Newport, which they entered on the 18th of August, 1485. Now, as camp is being set up for the night, there's a commotion which captures Henry's attention. And this is the arrival of somebody called Sir Gilbert Talbot. And Sir Gilbert has now chosen this moment to defect. And he is one of the most influential authorities in Shropshire. And he's decided, now is the time I'm going to betray my king and I'm going to go and support this Tudor invader. And he was able to bring with him several hundred men. At the same time, there are more Englishmen defective on Richard III's side. These are men like Roger Acton, Thomas Croft and Richard Corbett of Herefordshire, John Hamley of Worcestershire, and Robert Point from Gloucestershire. If any of you have those surnames, some of your ancestors might have been traitors to King Richard III. These are Yorkist diehards. These are men who had served the Yorkist regime for 20 years, and they are now choosing to put their faith in Henry Tudor. What does that say about how Richard III's reputation is starting to decline even in his own lifetime? It can't always be Tudor propaganda that put paid to Richard's reputation. The next day, the now swollen army heads on and it reaches Stafford. And it is here that Henry's most consequential meeting so far occurs. The man who greeted him in Stafford is a chap called Sir William Stanley. And he is one of the leading lights in the entire northwestern region. He is the power in many ways in North Wales and also in Cheshire. He is brother to Thomas Lord Stanley, Baron Stanley, who marshals all of the Stanley manors, the Stanley palaces in Lancashire. So you've got William Stanley, the Cheshire of the King, and now you have Lord Stanley, the Cheshire of the King. It's interesting that Henry having this meeting with William Stanley. Now, William Stanley has actually been tasked by Richard III to head straight to Stafford and take down this Tudor. Just wipe him out, destroy him. You have the men, you have the knowledge, you have the military know-how to take down Henry Tudor. But William Stanley does not do that. It is in fact William Stanley who sent that messenger to Shrewsbury asking Thomas Picton to open the gates. Betrayal is in the air already, long before the final moments of the Battle of Bosworth. And there's very good reasons why the Stanleys are flirting with Henry Tudor, even though their king is telling them what to do. And that's because Thomas Lord Stanley is married to a magnificent lady called Margaret Beaufort. And Margaret Beaufort is Henry Tudor's mother. So Lord Stanley is Henry Tudor's stepfather. You can see how the mechanics are probably working in his head. Does he stay just a loyal baron in the northwest, or does he put the moves in action to become stepfather to the king? What an opportunity all of this is for the Stanleys, who are ambitious beyond measure. And so far, despite how powerful, despite how rich they were, they have been denied access into the upper ranks of the nobility. If they could get Henry Tudor on that throne, wow. So William Stanley meets with Henry Tudor and he advises him that though the Stanleys would support Henry Tudor in any forthcoming battle, they could not be seen to do so openly. Very clever, the Stanleys. Because though Richard III, they did not like him, Richard III did not like them, the problem is Richard III has Lord Stanley's son, George Stanley, hostage. So if the Stanleys make their move too early, then Richard III is just going to kill Lord Stanley's son. So the Stanleys are saying, we're with you, but we don't want anyone to know we're with you. Richard, during this period, is actually in Nottingham. This is where he based himself like a spider in the centre of his web. He's in the centre of his kingdom, awaiting news of which way to go to take down this Tudor invasion. And there's no time to waste for Henry at all. Reaching London and seizing the capital, this now had to be the goal. They had to get to London. If you take London, you take the mechanical government, you've taken the kingdom. So, after a night in Stafford, onwards they press. On the morning of the 19th of August, Henry's army, without the Stanleys, they begin to plod on. They passed over Wolsey Bridge. They covered 17 or so miles until they reached the robust stone walls that encircled not just a prosperous town, but a soaring cathedral with no less than 3 immense spires. Can you see where I'm going here? Now, the Welsh in Henry Tudor's army, they may have known this place to be Llwyd Coed or Greywood. The Welsh have always called this area Greywood, Llwyd. The English and his troops, they knew it very well to be Lichfield. I'm sure they're not bigger tonight. Now that evening, the 19th, they march up to the town walls and they camp there. They camp outside the town walls. But once daybreak on the 20th comes, Henry gives the order for his army to head through the very modest and I believe wooden gateway, which granted access onto Beacon Street, up there in the top corner. I think this is a map from the year 1601, so it's probably not quite exact as it would be in 1485, but it gives us a very good idea of the geography of Lichfield during this period. Now, Lichfield was, as I'm sure you all know, by any metric, one of the most important settlements in the Midlands, and one which has existed in some guises since the advent of the Romans. I mean, the Romans had established a base nearby, not too far from you. Lichfield grew in prominence when St. Chad, Bishop of Mercia, moved his seat here in the 7th century. And it sat at a very crucial crossroads between two very nationally significant Roman roads. These two big Roman roads which crisscross the country, they meet just outside the edge of modern Lichfield. Now, on the 20th of August, Henry and his men, they marched down this street in the corner, and his soldiers, presumably, we don't have an exact source for it, but presumably they begin to fill these many streets in the centre of the town. Streets whose names we still recognise today. We've got Market Street, we've got Conduit Street, we've got Down Street, Frog Lane, and so on. All of these are in existence during 1485. Now, a very bustling economic hub, Lichfield was no stranger whatsoever to kings. We know from the historical record that Henry II, King John, Henry III, Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, Henry IV, even Henry V had all visited Lichfield. Edward IV, that triumphant King of York, he apparently spent 2 weeks here in 1473. Lichfield most certainly was not just a backwater in 1485, but it was a celebrated town in the very heart of England. And it still is, because we're all here tonight. But now, 1485, there is an invading army in the heart of her streets. But that said, if Polydore Virgil is to be believed, Henry Tudor was honourably received by the people of Lichfield. Polydore Virgil is a Tudor court chronicler who wrote the best primary source we have for what took place during this very interesting 2 weeks. And he says that Henry Tudor was honourably received. But you wouldn't really expect anything less, would you? With far more soldiers than there were people of Lichfield, it was far better for this town of around 1,000 people to just appear nothing less than obedient and respectful. They certainly weren't going to start shouting obscenities at this army. They would have got sacked very, very quickly. But that said, we do have another interesting source for this afternoon in Lichfield, and this comes from the Ballad of Bosworth. And this is a poem written for the Stanley family about this campaign about a decade after the events. Now, the unknown but very informed northern rhymer, he wrote how when Henry Tudor's army passed through the town of Lichfield, all of the guns were fired to herald his arrival, and all of the people were cheering. This rhymer writes that it was a goodly sight to see. Now, with a thriving market, one wonders if Henry or his soldiers made use of the many tradesmen in the town who worked with leather, shoes, cloth, and even weaponry to mend or supply the stuff the men had brought with them. There certainly were many taverns, we know, in the records in 15th century Lichfield that might have been busy that afternoon. They're definitely busy today, I know that. We've got records of pubs like the Lion in Market Street, the Antelope and the Unicorn in Bird Street, the Talbot, Angel and Cock Inns on Beacon Street, and the Star Inn on Bow Street. I also read in the historical record there are actually quite a lot of brothels in Lichfield during this period as well. But I'm going to guess that Henry demanded his men stay sober and they stay focused. Discipline was very important and crucial to win over the people whose streets he now marched in. In proclamations across the previous months, Richard III had repeatedly pumped out messages, propaganda of his own, in which he claimed that Henry's mob were nothing more than rapists and murderers. Henry Tudor was at great pains to portray himself and his men as whiter than white. He wanted people to believe that he had been sent here by God himself. Now, unfortunately, we cannot say where Henry brunched that afternoon. But if I was a gambling man, which luckily I'm not, I would say it would probably be the Tudor restaurant. You're better than me. Of course he would have gone there, wouldn't he? But no, Henry Tudor is a man in a rush. All through this campaign, he can't stay in one place for too long because he would be a sitting duck. So he leaves. Time is of the essence because word has reached him, Richard III is now on the move. So the route out of medieval Lichfield for those heading southeast is to take Rotten Road, to go past St Michael's Church and pick up the Tamworth Road, to go down this road now. As the name suggests, walking down Tamworth Road, his next destination, his next checkpoint was to go to Tamworth, probably passing and crossing the bridge at somewhere near Hopworth. Now, according to Polydor Virgil's testimony, though Henry's army reached Tamworth the next day, on the late afternoon of the 20th of August, Henry and a very small band of his followers, they didn't. The army reaches Tamworth, but Henry Tudor doesn't. Polydor writes, despite Henry's noble courage, he suddenly became overwhelmed by a great fear. And the great fear was that the Stanleys were actually going to betray him, that the Stanleys were playing him. He certainly could not ever hope to win this battle without the Stanley army on his side. And so Henry, instead, he takes a time out to consider his options. Maybe he thought of fleeing. To this point in time, Henry has already made 3 escapes for his life during his very troublesome upbringing. He is a survivor. He is a naturally cautious and pragmatic man. When he becomes king, people to this day still call Henry Tudor a paranoid and suspicious king. That doesn't come out of nowhere. He had spent his life up to becoming king escaping. His senses are telling him something is off. Now, whatever his intentions, as he loitered somewhere near Tamworth, in the evening, the small group he has with him, numbering maybe 10 or 20 men, they suddenly decide to head back to the army, and they can't find their way. They are lost somewhere outside Tamworth. When his army wakes the next morning without their leader present, some of those men panicked that they had been abandoned. In the medieval period, any army without their leader, they are ripe for the slaughter. It's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a medieval soldier. But before disorder could spread through the ranks, Henry suddenly reappears, and he has a very cheerful countenance on his face. He boldly declares that he hadn't been missing at all. He had merely been visiting what he called were his secret friends. And he said, he has good news. Now, I recently learned from John of the existence of, I don't know how to say it, Haslower Hall, Hazelower, okay, this nice hall, outside Lichfield, roughly halfway between Lichfield and Tamworth, and it has connections to the Stanley family. Today it's a gorgeous timbered house, a typically grand Tudor stately home. But back in the 15th century, this was a more modest manor, a more modest moated hall. So when Henry goes missing for this brief moment in time, is it possible that he actually went up to this hall for an emotional rendezvous, an emotional reunion with his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who is also Lady Stanley? Now, we know during this period that Margaret Beaufort is officially under house arrest for plotting conspiracy against Richard III. And it's always assumed that house arrest takes place up in Lancashire. Could she have actually been brought down to this Stanley home, not too far from here? It's a very tantalising thought, and so I thought I'd do a little bit more digging. Now, it does seem that this hall was in the hands of the Stanley family during the period in question, but it was a different branch to that which Margaret Beaufort had married into. Now, a local figure of significant influence who lived in and around Lichfield during this period was a man called Humphrey Stanley. And Humphrey Stanley is a distant cousin to Lord Stanley. This Humphrey had inherited through his mother's line the manors of Elford, Pipe and Clifton Campbell, and this inheritance also included the hall that stood here. Humphrey was a former sheriff of Staffordshire, and he was one of those who now chose this moment to defect from Richard III. It's a decision for which he would actually later be rewarded with. He would be granted a knighthood. He would become Sir Humphrey Stanley. Though he would serve 2 more times as Sheriff of Staffordshire, he actually seems to be a bit of an unpredictable, maybe unlikable character. For example, in the late 1480s, after Henry Tudor is on the throne of England, which is perhaps a bit of a spoiler for what's going to come, there is a report that in the records that this guy, Humphrey, he kept on smashing up the aqueduct that was carrying the water from his spring in Pipe all the way to the cathedral in Lichfield. The abbots and the monks at Lichfield kept on complaining that he keeps on breaking the aqueduct, literally using the thing smashed up and stopping them, people in Lichfield, from having water. One day, the dean and the chapter, they go down to repair the aqueduct, when his wife goes and smashed it up. It's a very interesting little glimpse in the records, for which we have no reason, no way of knowing what is going on. Why is Mr. and Mrs. Stanley smashing up the aqueduct? What is that all about? That's very weird behaviour, whatever their motivations. And this caused the people of Lichfield to actually have to write to Henry VII, demanding that he stops his guy from doing this. And Henry VII does. He does order Humphrey Stanley to sort himself out. In 1493, Humphrey Stanley is also back on the front pages of the medieval Daily Times, because through what we're told is an act of envy, he actually arranged the assassination of a local chap named William Chetwynd. Now, Chetwynd received a letter to his property from an acquaintance of his asking him to meet him at 5 a.m. But the letter was a forgery. When Chetwynd arrived at the meeting point on Topsdale Heath at 5 a.m., 20 men suddenly set upon him. They are armed with bows and they are armed with spears, and they murder him. Sir Humphrey just so happened to be following past on his horse just to check what exactly is going on. He probably wanted to make sure that the deed was done. Something, in fact, John Gotti would do in 1985 during a mafia war in New York. Again, very odd behaviour from these type of men. With that said, Humphrey Stanley doesn't seem to have ever fallen foul of Henry Tudor, and along with his more famous Stanley relations, Henry Tudor, of course, is a king that he would help to make. There is actually this memorial in Westminster Abbey to Humphrey Stanley. Most people simply walk over it because Westminster Abbey is a very busy place and there are a lot of monuments. And this local legend is actually commemorated with a very beautiful brass in Westminster Abbey. I think that the argument that Henry left behind his army to go meet with the Stanleys improbable. I think there's very good cause to believe that maybe he did come and meet with his secret friends, the Stanleys, but it may very well have just been Humphrey Stanley he met at this hall rather than his mother, Margaret Beaufort. But again, who knows? All things are possible in this period where we don't have the sources to prove or disprove them nonetheless. Anyway, we at Humphrey notwithstanding, on the morning of the 21st of August, Henry Tudor and his army, they leave Tamworth behind. They pick up Watling Street and they follow this Roman medieval motorway all the way until they arrive at Arthurstone. It is here that Henry once again meets with William Stanley, but also this time, for the very first time, he meets with a stepfather that he never knew. A stepfather who would now have his destiny in his hands, and that is, of course, Thomas Lord Stanley. Now, we don't know the exact details, which is a recurring theme, but Henry probably sought solid assurances from his stepfather and from the Stanleys that they would in fact back him in the forthcoming battle. According to Polydore Virgil, who again knew the people and took all his information from the people involved, he claimed that Henry took Lord Stanley by the hands and this moved everyone to great joy. Now further defectors continue to pour into Tamworth. Richard III is losing men left, right and centre at this moment, and thoughts are turning to the very inevitable battle that lays ahead. That afternoon, Henry's army makes one final short journey, and they do so to reach Merivale. They step up to the edge of the Abbey, of which this is the only existing works, in the private backyard of a wonderful bed and breakfast called Abbey Farm. And they camp there. They camp there on this night, knowing the battle is now inevitable. Richard III is known to be in the area. Henry's scouts are telling him Richard has come and he's blocked off Watling Street. He's blocked off the path forward. Now, Henry's army has marched 220 miles in just 14 days. It's an extraordinary feat, but it is now clear that the moment of destiny was upon them. The Battle of Bosworth Field, as it's become known to later generations, it changed the face of England and Wales forever. The clash triggered a series of events that would lay the foundations for the eventual formation of a new Britain under the victor's descendants. More than 500 years later, military historians and archaeologists continue to debate exactly how the battle unfolded and where the action passed out. Now, recent discoveries have thankfully allowed us to add to our understanding of one of the most pivotal events in the history of the islands, and the expectation is that more will one day be uncovered. But the principal facts, however, appear to be broadly thus. On the morning of 22nd of August 1485, two armies gathered under the blue sky on a Leicestershire field, roughly equidistant between the villages of Ferry Drayton, Dadlinton, Stoke Golden, Upton and Cheltenham. Basically this field. As the only battle of the Wars and Roses in which both claimants to the throne were actually on the field at the same time, this was going to be a momentous day regardless of the outcome. Situated up on a ridge to the side of the armies were the Stanleys. They still had not gone to side with their king, Richard III, which made him very angry, and they were still not coming down to side with Henry Tudor, which made him very anxious. Now, according to Edward Hall, who wrote a generation later, Henry took the opportunity for one last speech, perhaps the final one he would give in his life. But if the day did not go his way, Henry was going to be killed. Now, as per Hall, this is my friend, who's a reenactor, and I'm snapping with a microphone in his hand, so it's a good picture for this. According to Edward Hall, Henry Tudor faced his men, and he demanded, "Let us therefore fight like invisible giants." It was their duty, Henry said, to overcome Richard the tyrant, and to give victory to everyone in England, which would lead to an abundance of riches for all. Now the fight there, when it began, it was bloody and violent, one of the greatest of severities. Henry's vanguard, commanded by a chap named John de Vere, it took out Richard's own vanguard. It's a great clash in the middle, very much like a modern rugby scrum. But in the distance, as the fight started to look like it was tipping away from Richard, in the distance, he noticed Henry Tudor. And Henry Tudor was not part of his main army. He had a small bodyguard and he had stayed aloof. He had stayed at the back of the army, perhaps able to escape if the moment came down to it. But Richard had seen him, and Richard had decided, if I go down and kill this man who's got no military experience, whereas I, Richard, have all the experience in the world, the battle is over. He lowers his visor, he gives the order to his small bodyguard, and they go. It is a great moment. It's one of the great last cavalry charges of the medieval period. And it must have been something to behold. Richard is thundering across the fields, defending his crown on horseback, and his household crashes into Henry Tudor's. You can see this wonderful painted by Graham Turner that captures the moment that Richard sweeps in and takes out Henry Tudor's standard bearer, bringing that great flag dropping. It looks like Henry shouting bravely in the back, but I'm sure he was very scared and fearful at this moment. It looks like the Battle of Bosworth is over. It looks like Henry Tudor is about to be killed by a powerful, courageous and valiant King of England. But now is the moment that Stanley finally make their move. They come down from their ridge, and when they crash into this melee, it is Richard that they crash into. They have picked their moment, and they have done what they said they would do, which is come in on Henry Tudor's side. One of the most infamous moments in English history. Now, in the frenzied and furious onslaught, Richard is removed from his horse, he is overwhelmed, and he is brutally murdered. Despite being given the option to escape, he chooses to die, like one chronicler says, like a brave and most valiant prince. And he would in fact be the final King of England to ever die in battle. Now when word spread that King Richard was dead, the fighting is all ground to a halt. Those who were on Richard's side, they simply threw down their weapons and they surrendered. Richard's bloody body was taken back, it was put over a horse, and it was taken back to Leicester to be publicly displayed. Now once he had caught his breath, Henry Tudor departed the site of battle and he went up to a local small hill. A small hill, he'd had enough of hills after Tudor marching up them. It's a very small hill that even I can walk up without losing my breath. He gets up there and he gives thanks to God and he gives thanks to his troops. Now during the closing moments of battle, the golden crown that Richard III had been wearing, it had fallen off his helmet and it had been wrenched loose and fallen in a bush. The man we're told who picked up that crown is William Stanley himself. He approaches Henry Tudor, boldly, brilliant, and he goes, "Sire, I make you King of England," which is quite bold words to be sure. And I'm sure it must have upset Henry Tudor, because 10 years later he has William Stanley's head chopped off. But that's a different story. Henry Tudor is now the King of England, and he does so because of the march that he took. He is able to do so because of towns like Lichfield that simply stepped aside and allowed him to pass through. The Tudor era had begun, and Lichfield did play its part in that story. Thank you very much.
So just before we break,